do that this time.
Okay, great. So we wanted to say thanks to the Muriel Rukeyser Living Archive for sponsoring these conversations, and we're really happy to be part of the first one here. So we'll just get into it. So on April 5th, 1965, Muriel Rukeyser gave a reading of The Outer Banks at the Library of Congress just 1 year after suffering a stroke that required her to relearn speech. 3 years later, this pivotal poem appeared in the collection Speed of Darkness, which resonated deeply with second-wave feminists and reignited interest in her work. We want to talk about this important poem, but since many of us have studied different periods of Rukeyser's work, I wanted to set up our conversation by highlighting the continuity of her activist concerns from the 1940s to the 1960s, even as they, along with her aesthetic strategies, evolved in response to societal changes. Her commitment to working class and anti-racist struggles that began in the 1930s Popular Front youth movement and became international with the Spanish Civil War persisted throughout her life, but took on new forms as her context changed. National and international political developments from the late 1930s motivated her to shift from documentary modernism in poetry to other genres such as biography and film scripts, evolving a language for process and democracy, seeking to influence the public imagination. During World War II, at the Office of War Information, she and other artists created posters and a public exhibit at the New York Public Library to promote anti-racist democratic inclusiveness. However, the work was undermined by internal OWI politics, anti-Semitism, and the racism prevalent among Southern Democrats. Resistance to her work by these groups, and then after the war by the new critics and Cold War ideologues, intensified her sense that poetry, a more introspective genre, could play a vital role in reinforcing democratic practices. In The Usable Truth in 1941, she writes about how poetry can help us face, quote, the tragic and the complex and develop democratically, unquote. Life of Poetry, published in 1949, describes a triadic dialogue between the writer, the text, and the reader, where each is always dynamically changing, as is, we note, context. In a 1959 interview with Lee Anderson, she highlights how poetry can help a society to develop by, quote, bringing to consciousness the buried life of the emotions among us at this time, the ways in which the poem, living and moving in time, can call upon the ideas of flow, of growth, of transformation in us. She explains that her sources for these ideas come from, quote, the language of water, of embryology, of morphology in books like Thompson's Growth and Form, to make a vocabulary that seems almost lacking in present English of process, unquote. This understanding of a triadic poetic process potentially allows for the building of a kind of communal intersubjectivity that fosters democracy, as Raphael Allison and Catherine Gander have noted. Motherhood also changed her. After the war, despite the challenges of the new critical ethos and the Cold War persecution of the left, Rukeyser remained committed to her organic process-oriented poetry. She moved to California in 1944. The birth of her son Bill in 1947, and analysis with Jungian therapist Francis Wicks, emboldened her to write more explicitly about gender, shame, and sexuality. The shift deepened her exploration of embodied life, and her 1949 visit to the Kwakwaka'wakw people in Vancouver for the research on Franz Boas also affirmed these explorations. In The Orgy, a book about her 1958 visit to Puck Fair in Ireland, she reflects, quote, I was brought up not to talk about three things: sex, money, and death. And the excrement, the wet and the dirty. You know how they work on our cities to keep them dry? Try to display life as not sticky, not wet. I don't know why this should do. In 1954, she began teaching at Sarah Lawrence College, and the advent of the civil rights movement led to new commitments for Rukeyser. In 1958, she wrote the film script for All the Way Home, a film discouraging white flight in the wake of the Supreme Court rulings on desegregation. Her class syllabi explored the work of Black writers, and she became involved with the Teachers and Writers Project, which sent writers into New York public city schools in 1967. The anti-war, Black power, and feminist movements also changed the context for poetry, as Craig will discuss.
As Trudi said, Speed of Darkness is a book that is of the 1960s. Most of the poems were written early or mid-decade, but it was published in 1968. What I want to do now is give a sense of the poetry world that Speed of Darkness was engaged with. The poetry world of the 1960s was vibrant, vital, diverse, and like everything else about the decade, disorienting and confusing and rapidly changing. The world at the end of the decade bore little resemblance to the way it looked in 1960. At the beginning of the decade, most of the high modernist elders were still alive. Robert Frost, William Carlos Williams, T.S. Eliot, and H.D., not yet recognized as a germinal figure. She was. They all lived until mid-decade. Ezra Pound and W.H. Auden lived into the 1970s. At the dawn of the decade, a battle over the question of what poetry mattered and why took shape around the two anthologies you see on the screen. New Poets of England and America, edited by Donald Hall, Robert Peck, and Lewis Simpson, consciously embraced a late modernist formalism centered in the Academy. At the close of the introduction to the volume, Robert Frost wrote that, quote, 1,000, 2,000, colleges, town and gown together in the little town they make, give us the best audience for poetry ever had in all the world. The poetry in the volume is formalist, restrained, seeking after what they would have referred to as universal truths. In stark contrast, the New American Poetry, edited by Donald Allen and published by Evergreen Press, which was associated with the avant-garde, anticipated the various postmodernisms that would emerge during and after the decade. It was a call for radically new forms. Looking to Pound and William Carlos Williams, the poets associated with the Black Mountain School, the New York School around Frank O'Hara primarily, John Ashbery's early work, and the San Francisco Renaissance, explored the possibilities of what Charles Olson called projective poetics. Form is never more than an extension of content, Olson wrote in the touchstone essay of the anthology. Keep it moving as fast as you can, citizen. A lot of what Olson has to say there echoes the quote that Trudi read from The Life of Poetry. Sarah Dawes has written a very good essay exploring the relationship between Olson and Rukeyser, arguing, I think, convincingly that Rukeyser should be recognized as a key figure in the sensibility in the New American poetry, and making the point that she was almost entirely ignored. Whether she was actively drawing on Olson or not is something that I think merits still further exploration. Both anthologies were mostly white and mostly male. There were only 6 women among the 54 contributors to New Poets of England and America. Only Mae Swenson and Rich, Audrey and Rich, would attain any prominence, and Rich mostly for her rebellion against the New Poets' sensibility. There were just 4 women among the 44 poets included in New American poetry, the most notable Denise Levertov. Leroy Jones, who was not yet a Mary Baraka, was the only Black poet in either anthology. It's striking that there was very little direct political engagement in either of the anthologies. Over the next 15 years, a series of influential anthologies embracing political awareness would define the 1960s, chronicled and created a new poetic landscape. You see some of those up there. Blackfire, an anthology edited by Leroy Jones and Larry Neal. On the right, Where's Vietnam? American Poets Respond to the War. What's worth noting here is that these books did not circulate primarily on campuses. I picked up Where's Vietnam at the paperback rack of the local grocery store that I worked at in the mid-1960s. Next screen. With this in mind, and then by the time we get to the 1970s, we have the appearance of anthologies emphasizing the poetry of women. No More Masks here, get to the line in a second, which very much emphasized the emergence of the various feminist movements. With that in mind, Trudi and I created the map of the poetry world of America in the 1960s. It was a very diverse scene, but in the largest tension there is between the East Coast, a corridor running from Boston and New York down to Black Mountain in North Carolina, but centered around poets who were of the East Coast at that point. On the West Coast, centered primarily in San Francisco with outposts in Seattle and elsewhere, there was a alternative poetry world. City Lights bookstore in San Francisco was the center of that. And then in the Midwest, there were various scenes, some around the University of Minnesota, where you would have John Berryman was in there, Robert Bly, but also the Black arts movement poetry, Black nationalist poetry, which emerged around small presses in Chicago and Detroit. There were other very interesting regional scenes. The Chicano and Native American scene involved, centered primarily in the Southwest, beginning to emerge in the Northwest. A Southern set of poets who had, in many ways, their own sensibility. But I think that if you focus on the East Coast, the Boston, New York, Black Mountain, and the West Coast, the San Francisco-centered scenes, you get a sense of the primary tensions there. Now, what's interesting is that many poets move back and forth between those scenes. Levertov was associated with Black Mountain, but also the New York scene. Leroy Jones, particularly became Baraka with the Black arts scene in the Midwest. Gwendolyn Brooks was worked at the Seek, the community poetry educational program in New York City, along with June Jordan, Audre Lorde, Rich later in the decade. We have a few lines that you can see there suggesting the connections. Allen Ginsberg was everywhere at one time or another. But when we actually start drawing the lines, connecting who was here, who was there, it wound up looking like we'd spilled spaghetti on the map, and it became useless for getting a sense of it. The point being is it was a very diverse scene by the end of the decade. And when Rukeyser entered into it, she certainly was a part of that scene and could have been included in many of the anthologies, but she was largely ignored. She was largely invisible at the time. And one of the things we're going to talk about is why that shouldn't have been the case, and why later, with particularly Audrey and Rich playing a key role in it, she would emerge and be recognized as the ancestor she was. A lot of this, of course, just simply has to do with the failure to acknowledge American women poets. Now, another piece of this scene that's crucial in understanding that is that all of these poets, in one way or another, were in conversation with musicians and lyricists who took their roles as bards and troubadours seriously. Bob Dylan is the most obvious version there. Also Leonard Cohen, Jimi Hendrix, Jim Morrison, Joni Mitchell. Bob Dylan, maybe apocryphally called Smokey Robinson, Motown lyricist, America's greatest living poet. The photos you've just seen here give you a sense of how those connections worked out. Here you see Allen Ginsberg on the right, Bob Dylan in the middle, Michael McClure, who was a key figure in the primal poetics out of the West Coast, together. Next screen, you see Diane DePrima and Leroy Jones in New York in 1960. The next screen, you see Allen Ginsberg, Gary Snyder at the left-hand side, Lenore Kandel to Ginsberg's right, who was the author of a very controversial book called The Love Poem, The Love Book, Book of Poetry, that was heavily censored and therefore got a large audience during the late 1960s. Again, having nothing whatsoever to do with the academic poetry scene that Frost wrote about earlier. All of these scenes came together to reshape the sense of the relationship between the poet, the audience, the text, and the changing political contexts of the time. Rukeyser's poetry really connects her primarily with a sense of process, the process-oriented postmodernism. that Sarah Dawes talks about, her relationship with Olson. She couldn't have been included in New Poets of England and America. She simply wouldn't have fit. Her work certainly could have fit in the New American Poetry. It's very clear that she was aware that, to quote Dylan, there's something happening here at the time. Lines from The Speed of Poetry reflect that awareness, and particularly in relationship to the dawning feminist movement of that time, played a crucial role. The line, "No more masks, no more mythologies," from the poem Is Mask, provided the title for the groundbreaking anthology. Her line, "What would happen if one woman told the truth about her life? The world would split open," from Katja Kalwitz, also became a feminist mantra. Her awareness of the civil rights movement was not just the activism that Trudi mentioned, but shows up in the poetry. In Outer Banks, there's the image of the Black man speaking to my heart, crisis of darkness in this century, of moments of this speech. And Vietnam enters into poems like The War Comes Into My Room, where Muriel writes, knowing again that nothing has been spoken, not now, not this nighttime, the broken singing as we move or of the endless war of our lives. In Delta poems, she provides images of the victims of American bombing, anticipating Rich's The Burning of Paper Instead of Children. So we'll pause here and take questions or comments before we go back to the speed